afternoon. My name is Dr. Lüdert. I'm happy to invite you all to a discussion on a side event as part of the STI-Forum at the United Nations entitled Strengthening the Science Policy Society Interface, an Analytical Framework for Science Diplomacy in an Era of Technological Change. Before we get started, I wanted to give an opportunity to our speakers to introduce themselves. Just briefly, I am the head of programs at the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York, and we are very pleased to have been able to secure such an interesting set of panelists joining us today. I hand it over to Leah Díaz for her introduction.
Thank you so much, Jan and Martin and Ona. It's a pleasure for me here today. So I'm a professor and fellow at CUNY Graduate Center, and as I was saying, I'm affiliated to these institutions, and this institution in particular are trying to promote research, hold seminars, workshops on relevant topics for the international society, such as science, diplomacy, technology, and innovation. That's what we're talking about today. So thank you again for having me today here in the panel.
I can go next. Thank you so much, Leah and Jan, for having us in the team, making this happen. I'm Ona Ambrozaite. I am co-director of the Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub in Washington, D.C. And in addition to that, I'm also finishing up on PhD in quantum materials. So it's a fun science and science diplomacy life. And I'm very happy to talk about how academic institutions like Johns Hopkins can be part of the conversation in science diplomacy.
This is Martin Wählisch from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the United Nations Secretariat. I lead the innovation team in the Policy Mediation Division. Pleasure to be with you, and thanks for Jan for bringing us together.
Thank you all. Hello into the audience, and just as a brief way to give you a foreshadow how we will proceed, I will begin by offering the framework for our discussion today, followed by Martin Wählisch, Leah, and Ona with particular case studies to illustrate the policy science society interface and how we can strengthen this. So to jump right in, the impetus for today is to offer a science diplomacy framework to think through technological advancement, and also to articulate the indispensable role of science diplomacy in fostering international dialogue and cooperation for global policy formulation. We want to assess the potential of science diplomacy to function as a pivotal bridge, linking scientific innovation with worldwide collaborative efforts, and also reveal strategic approaches to bolster the interaction among science, policy, and societal actors, focusing here on initiatives that elevate public confidence in science, enhance research, development support, and essentially cultivate progressive science and technology policies. Aiming to deepen the strategic comprehension of science diplomacy's role in generating sustainable, resilient, and innovative solutions amidst complex crises. It outlines actionable steps for scientists and policymakers alike, as well as funding institutions and others, to mitigate the disconnect between knowledge production and its practical implementation at the science policy society nexus. As I think we're all aware, the last decade has seen an increased move to integrate scientific research and policy. From issues like vaccine development, space exploration, climate resilience, scientific cooperation lies at the center of tackling the many challenges facing policymakers and global citizens today. The term science diplomacy, on the other hand, is often used to describe a set of activities at the intersection of science, technology, and foreign diplomacy. In this shifting landscape of international relations and global policymaking, the role and concept of science diplomacy continues to develop. And as some of my colleagues here in the room can attest from our discussions earlier today, it can encompass various approaches: diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy, and science in diplomacy. The promise of science diplomacy to solving complex global issues, in our view, requires multiple actor input. Global policy formulation thereby requires to build out a taxonomy of units of analysis encompassing actors located at global, state, and non-state levels. This includes international organizations, especially the UN system, governments, academia, private and public actors. As such, substantive and science-grounded policy formulation confronts coordination problems across these units of analysis, including, but not limited to, access and participation asymmetries, as well as translation and interpretation needs between actors and institutions. Global issues related to the environment, human security and health, emergent technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing, national security and international relations are complex, defy simple or static policy because they're rapidly evolving and inherently uncertain, messy, as well as synergistic. Effective policy thereby aims to affect these issues, requires sustained collaboration between policymakers and scientists from various disciplines, working across states at all levels of governance. This type of entanglement relies on open institutions and a problem-solving culture based on conceptual coherence, shared values, and practices among scientists, diplomats, legislators, and policy practitioners. On this basis, this policy conversation we're having here, and also the accompanying brief that we have formulated, which is available to all of you, as well as the general public on the STI website, is to strengthen the science policy society interface by shedding light on variances on the one side, the supply side, which is science and academia, and the demand side, which is policymakers and governance institutions. And these are used in an ecosystem that can be bridged by identifying practical means to better support the nexus here in front of us. So strengthening the information flow between the supply side and the demand side, in our view, includes on the supply side, in terms of knowledge production and scientific expertise, which is provided by researchers and scientists in higher education institutions that are relevant to the policy process. We suggest 4 concrete policy suggestions. First, to integrate science diplomacy and sustainable development goals into curricular and research agendas. Second, to expand opportunities for scientists to require skills relevant to policymaking. 3, to consider starting at the moment of funding applications and throughout the entire research cycle, the application of scientific findings for policy formulation. And 4th, to enhance scientific communication of scientific work and novel findings into societal discourse in order to raise awareness and establish trust in epistemic communities of praxis. We believe that on the supply side, by raising awareness, developing relevant skills, promoting interdisciplinary collaboration, and encouraging research and innovation, and engaging in community outreach, we trust a stronger science policy interface is fostered. On the demand side, on the other hand, that is to improve the basis of policy that is grounded in scientific findings and up-to-date evidence. Policymakers required to establish, on the one hand, number 1, open access and participation channels to scientists and include a mandate that requires policy to be grounded in science and evidence-based findings, which seems non-obvious, but unfortunately not necessarily practiced. Number 2, to incorporate research and methods into the entire life cycle of the policy formulation process. And of course, this is complicated, and we've had conversations this morning in a rapidly evolving environment where technology like AI and others are really complicating the policy process. Number 3, to establish means of active exchange and personnel between science and policy institutions, including in the recruitment, retention, and overall team building. In crafting effective policymakers along these 3 trajectories, policymakers must navigate a complex landscape of societal needs, economic constraints, and environmental considerations. Essential to this process is ensuring that policies are rooted in scientific findings and up-to-date evidence. To achieve this, policymaking must focus on enhancing the demand side of policymaking, ensuring that scientific input is not only accessible, but also integrated into every stage of the policy formulation process. Establishing open access channels, incorporating research and methods into the entire life cycle to be adaptive and responses all require active exchange with science and policymakers. In doing so, and in offering these recommendations, we have explored how science diplomacy can affect global policy formulation in this era of rapid technological advancement. And these strategic approaches were identified to enhance the interaction between science policy and society, focusing on initiatives to boost public confidence in science, support research and development, and shape progressive science and technology policies. By addressing the aforementioned coordination challenges, actionable steps are outlined in our policy brief in understanding science diplomacy's role in generating sustainable, resilient, and innovative solutions. Global policy formulation, in our view, involves a complex taxonomy of actors, as I've mentioned, spanning global, state, and non-state levels, including IGOs, governments, academia, and private sector. The impetus for this brief and our conversation here today is simple. Science is a central part of modern life and international relations. However, the authority of science is epistemic communities, epistemic communities situated in research institutions, industry, and governance are no longer taken for granted and imbued with a public trust they once had. Systemic and unwarranted rejection of science, that is science skepticism, has become a major societal problem. That poses a threat to the very fabric of liberal democracy and a value-based global order. An environment where notions of objectivity, of free expression of science, of facts, and of evidence are being undermined, or in some instances ignored, the relevance of science diplomacy is not a trivial matter. On the contrary, scientific exchange requires an open environment for critical, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral engagement instead of being delimited by skeptics and a mistrust of evidence-based research. Science diplomacy, therefore, must grapple with challenges imposed by non-scientific power political considerations. A new science diplomacy may contribute to civil society dialogue, to sustainable development and society of society and economy, as well as to acknowledging national interests. Such a science diplomacy approach aligns goals differently from region to region and weighs the opportunities and risks of international cooperations against each other. In an increasingly disorderly multipolar world, this new science diplomacy may contribute to the negotiation and implementation of multilateral partnerships. Despite the variance between scientific research and policy output, efforts to bridge the science policy and society interface are hindered by limited exposure to science diplomacy and a lack of capacity to deliver science advice. To address this gap, steps were proposed in this short introduction to strengthen this interface by shedding light on the variance between the supply side, science and academia, and the demand side, policymakers and governance institutions. Fostering cross-sectoral engagement between those two is why we're here, and we hope that this integrative approach bridges the action knowledge gap that exists and facilitates the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. With those introductory remarks, I would like to hand it over to Martin Wählisch. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jan. Colleagues, good to be with you. I thought I addressed three things. Number one, why I think science diplomacy matters now. Number two, a few considerations with regard to the different supply and demand aspects that Jan described. And then I also wanted to give a little bit of insight on what we have been up to in the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs on how to use scientific discoveries to advance diplomacy. Now, let me start with why this matters. It will be probably for historians to say whether we live in this, which some call scientific revolution, something we've seen in the past in the 16th and 17th century, where when you think about it, Isaac Newton defined the laws of motion and gravity, and chemistry played a big role. And there's the question out there, right? Are we living in a similar scientific revolution nowadays with digital technologies being so present and artificial intelligence really just kind of changing every part of humanity, from logistics to how we treat diseases or how we make decisions in the context of peace and security. So in that regard, and also in light of the political mess with the many conflicts that we face, science diplomacy is kind of a beacon to hold on to and believe in, as it creates an opportunity to see how on a neutral ground science can be a platform to bring cultures and nations together. And I think the pandemic in that regard was this unique global effort to exchange data on the pandemic and health data in general to fight the pandemic. But there are ongoing efforts that are maybe still in the shadow, like, for instance, an effort in Jordan that brings together different players from the region to look at biology and material sciences and physics that presented an example of how science is still a bridge amidst the many global challenges that we face. Now, a few thoughts on the policy brief that Jan just outlined. One is that I agree that science diplomacy can indeed play a crucial role in fostering international dialogue, and there are some examples that exemplify that. And I also believe that we indeed need a greater, a longer, a wider bridge between scientific research outputs that are often hidden in scientific peer-reviewed journals and books and libraries, and the actual policy implementation. Just speaking from the UN side, we have mechanisms in place like guidance lessons learned units, like innovation teams that pull from this pool of scientific discoveries into the United Nations, right? So there are those avenues, apart obviously from UNESCO, which is a dedicated institution for science and research and education as such. And just to point out one mechanism that some of you might be familiar with, and that's the Secretary General's initiative on the academic impact. So there's a Secretary General's initiative on academic impact. A lot of institutions around the world have joined this initiative, and there's literally an avenue available to put out challenges to academic institutions from the UN side, and on the other side, on the academic side, to have an avenue to bring discoveries back to a global institution like the United Nations. And us in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, we have used those mechanisms in the past. For instance, when we were looking for advice on virtual reality and how VR could be used for peace building, where many of the partners that are part of this SG academic impact initiative have responded to us. So there are existing mechanisms in place that are actively used by international organizations to replenish imagination, right? Get new ideas and discoveries into the work to tackle global affairs. So that's kind of one point I wanted to make. The other one.
I think we may have some technical issues with Martin being disconnected. We'll give him a moment to see whether this resolves itself. If not, I would suggest we continue with Leah, but let's maybe give it a few seconds to see. Right, well, as we're talking about technological advancement, we're also dealing with technological difficulties. So Leah, may I ask you to perhaps take over so we can keep the flow of the conversation?
I'm happy to pass the word to Martin whenever he's ready. So yes, so thank you again for having me today. So I'm part of this publication, and I wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to you, Jan, and also Martin for promoting this publication that I think it's so relevant in this time. But at the same time, I had the opportunity as well to read this policy briefing that you have shared with us today. And I really wanted, before going to my case study, to make some few comments that maybe can be positive for the conversation later. So first of all, Martin was asking, why do we need science diplomacy today? So from my point of view, and as we have been talking here today, science diplomacy is a unique tool, first of all, to address those global challenges that we all have been mentioning, like climate change, energy security, outer space, because we need the scientific and technological approach in order to address those challenges. But at the same time, I feel that it's an excellent tool for cooperation. The moment we try to work all the countries together in order to address those global challenges, it's going to be an opportunity to promote peaceful relations and at the same time democratic values. So I think it's a double gain here. At the same time, yeah, we have talked about digital revolution, the information society. And yeah, I mean, our lives have totally transformed since the 90s that we had first access to the internet. I remember because I'm a professor today, but when I was a student, I studied my whole college degree. It was all paper. It was non-computers until I started to do my PhD. So it was a total different world. So considering how fast technology is changing, sometimes we feel that we cannot keep up with that. So it seems to me that it's also necessary to, at some point, maybe also we can talk about this in the discussion, like regulation that I think that we have mentioned as well. And I think it's very important that these new technologies are going to be shared on democratic values and the respect for human rights, because there's also a negative side of technology that we can also talk about that later. At the same time, yeah, we have been talking about policy regulation, the role of universities. So I'm at the university. I've been teaching and, conducting research, but not only that. Now we have to do so many other things in terms of innovation. So what is the role of universities in society? I think that we have a big responsibility. And in terms of science diplomacy and addressing these global challenges, I'm remembering the conversation that we had before today in the session for the book. And I think she's there. She was trying to explain to us how in this course, she was introducing computer science for peace and human topics, So in this challenge to prepare as universities, not only to promote knowledge, but also cultivate challenges and prepare the future generations, how are we going to prepare the students? So yeah, I feel that today we need to reform the syllabi, the course descriptions. And I feel that we're moving from a time where, I don't know if you remember, but it seems that we needed to be hyper-specialized in a field. And I feel that now we're moving to a different type of approach, which is more interdisciplinary. So it seems to me necessary that the different programs should integrate science, technology, engineering, mathematics, thinking about future diplomats, that of course they need to be prepared and trained in international relations, diplomacy, social sciences, history. But at the same time, it seems to me necessary that we start to integrate in the curricula these other fields and subjects such as, which is called STEAM, like science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And of course, not only the curricula, but at the same time, research opportunities that I think I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk or the introduction, when I was saying that we also have the responsibility as being in education and universities to try to address all the current topics and provide solutions, and bridges to the society, to policymakers, this idea of interdisciplinarity and collaboration and transfer of knowledge. So on the one side, curricula, research opportunities that we, the professors, we need to promote these new lines, like the publication that we are participating today. It's a good example of that because it's a very new field and innovative, and we're trying to cast light, not only what has been done, but at the same time, what needs to be done, what we can do to improve. Martin, I don't know if you are ready, because you can, if you are ready, you can continue. Just let me know. Research lines, research opportunities. for us, the teachers, the educators, but at the same time, including the students in this type of avenues. And of course, I was thinking also about international exchanges, collaborations, the transfer between the university and society in terms of collaboration with different type of agencies, government. I remember that I was a couple of weeks ago, I was a speaker and also participating in a conference organized by CUNY on human rights. And we had the pleasure we had great keynotes. And in one of these keynotes, we had the pleasure to receive the deputy commissioner in New York City for international affairs, working with the mayor. And I had the opportunity to talk to her, and we just talk about many different topics that are happening today in the world. But at the same time, I thought, I hope that maybe we can collaborate. I mean, the Wählisch Institute for International Studies with the mayor, with the International Affairs office. And she was really happy about that. And maybe we can try to talk to establish this transfer and partnerships with offices, of the mayor, different type of government agencies. They can tell us what is needed, and we try as scientific educators, try to, at the same time, to promote this knowledge that it's necessary. So this was also an important idea about this transfer of knowledge and collaboration and partnership between university and then these other sectors in the society. Jan, you also mentioned in the paper integrating sustainable development goals in curricula. And then I think I need to talk about what my home university in Spain, University of Murcia, they launched it. I feel very proud. So this started in 2019. And this is a project launched by the rector, which is transversal and is touching all the different faculties and departments. And it's called 17 OOD because it's in Spanish, it's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And what we're trying to do is to raise awareness. That's something that you also mentioned in your paper, so that in general, not only the students, but trying to, because it consists of different type of activities, cultural, also talks, seminars, to try to raise awareness on what are the Sustainable Development Goals, why it is so important, how can we contribute. And the idea is that they are focusing on one Sustainable Development Goal each month, and they work with faculties and schools. And for instance, I was very lucky in the fall. They invited me to participate in a very interesting talk with environmental journalism. This was about climate change. So they invited the journalists, they invited me and also my students to have this talk with this journalist. And it was fascinating because I'm teaching media and democracy, but in the media school. So it was fascinating to have that opportunity to explore that sustainable development goal. And at the same time, I want to say that the students did great. We had a few weeks in advance, so I took some of the time in the lecturing to prepare for the session. So we try to cast light on sustainable development goals, because it's true that we need to update to the curricula, as we mentioned before, to integrate different type of challenges, and even though, for instance, in our syllabi, we need to specify. That's another point for education, and we need to specify in each course description, like what is the relation between the course we're teaching with sustainable development goals. And the next call for our rector, he wants that we introduce this content and into the courses, which I think it's a very positive thing. And tell me, Jan, how I'm doing with timing, because I have here many different notes, so I'm just going through some of the notes that I took. Regarding policy formulation, this goes again back to the conversation we are having, trying to promote peace, prosperity, addressing these global challenges, and considering that we are multiple actors in society, the educators, different agencies, government. So yeah, it seems to me that this is indispensable, that when formulating policies, we need to include the experts, and these experts are the scientists. So of course, this happened at the global level when we are talking about multilateral institutions, international organizations, diplomats, embassies. They need to start introducing this type of staff or expert of consultation. In the chapter that I will have to develop, I had to talk about diplomats as digital beings, because finally, digital diplomacy is going to complement traditional diplomacy. And then going back to this policy formulation, yeah, I feel it's very, very necessary when trying to find for solutions to certain problems or challenges. It can be climate change, we need to count on scientists. And I want to give you another example, which is also from my country and from my region. This is at the regional level, but I think that it can be also interesting to share with you today. And it's about climate change and the environment. In the south of Spain, we have a major severe problem with that. And I want to tell you that this has to do with, I'm going to say it in Spanish, mar menor, small c. It's a huge environmental disaster. The water is getting contaminated. So many of the species, are dying. It's very, very sad. The regional government, they're trying to take steps in order to tackle this major problem. And I'm happy to say that it has been created different type of platforms, and they are including necessarily, in order to address this major problem, they need to have consultations before decision-making processes, before launching any type of regulation. And if they really want that this regulation is going to be successful, they need to count on the experts and the scientists. Yeah, what can happen with the species? What's going to be happening with the temperature? All these type of things demand scientific expertise. And then when addressing these type of problems and trying to find for solutions that need to be policy making, need to be new regulations, it is indispensable and totally necessary that our elected officials at the global level, the diplomats, the foreign ministers, they need to incorporate in their teams people who are expert in technology, in different types of science. Today we were talking about outer space, biotechnology, nanotechnology, all those fields that to me, I don't know. So if I would needed to do something about this, to make some sort of decision, to propose, I'm a lawyer, so imagine that I would need to write a draft on all this. I should need to talk and to keep sessions with this expert.
Thank you, Leah. And perhaps with having Martin back here, and thank you also for illustrating the role of experts in science as well as society actors as part of the conversation and consultation for better policy at the global as well as local level. And the example you gave about your home was, I think, very apt. So let's give it back to Martin, who has rejoined. Hopefully the connection is more stable. Martin.
Thank you. Let's see whether the gods of the internet show me some mercy. There's nothing better than having a good old get together in person, even years after the pandemic, where we became so much more comfortable with tech. But let me pick up on what Leah just said on, getting more scientific advice into institutions. And I ended with mentioning the academic impact initiative of the Secretary General. And in the same vein, the UN on the highest level established an academic advisory group just the end of last year to provide senior leadership with insights on new discoveries. And on a lower level, we changed the HR rules, where we now, at least for the data side, can hire data scientists, not just statisticians, but like data scientists. So like we are seeing more job profiles that highlight that demand to bring in scientific knowledge. Now, whether every data scientist is actually a scientist, right, is a different question, but like there is some desire to bring in that expertise. And when you look at kind of chief data officers in international organizations or chief scientific advisors in international organizations beyond the World Health Organization, obviously, or UNESCO, like I'm talking about parts of the UN that are usually not bragging about using scientific knowledge. That has really changed over the last years. I wanted to give a few more examples of how we use scientific advancements to strengthen diplomatic efforts. And let me just point out three more. One is on the geospatial side, where we have a close collaboration with conflict modeling experts, geospatial experts from around the world. These are often niched kind of scientific discoveries that we employ to move forward conflict prevention. And on the geospatial side, that's we're really working hand in hand. And we just celebrated UN World Water Day on the 21st of April, where we gathered experts from around the world to learn from the latest academic and scientific work on water depletion. That's one example. A second example really spins around the issue of computational social affairs. So that has to do with how we can use computational approaches to unpack hate speech online, how we can monitor social media, where we have a heavy supply from the private sector and the intelligence field, but also a lot of good work that has been done on countering hate speech and detecting hate speech from the academic side. And here we have teamed up, for instance, with the American University of Beirut and Birzeit University to invest into low language resources and conflict monitoring. And that is so important because academic institutions often have a different time horizon than kind of donors that think about a 1-year cycle, and academic institutions, often think about 3-5-year projects, and that has been very helpful, especially for moonshot projects. So hate speech detection is one second example, and the third one is really when it comes to employing machine learning and artificial intelligence to advance the scouting of diplomatic signals. We have a tool out that is called Diplomatic Pulse. You can access the web scraper on diplomaticpulse.org, and that's a close collaboration we have with the Qatar Computing and Research Institute in Doha, where as a department we teamed up with scientists, they all have a PhD, to make sure that we use the power of new technologies to advance conflict analysis. And those three examples, geospatial, hate speech detection, and web scraping for diplomatic signals, are very, very concrete examples of how we work together with scientific and academic institutions to advance diplomacy. I'll leave it with that, Jan. Again, thanks so much for the patience, and thanks to the internet gods for allowing me to speak a bit longer. Back to you.
Thank you, Martin. And last but not least, Ona, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Jan and Martin and Leah. I'm glad to be part of this. And Martin, I'm glad the gods of the internet allowed you to finish your talk here. So thanks for that. And yeah, just really briefly, I'm more than happy to contribute from more Johns Hopkins University perspective. Again, how these universities can become central spaces to ensure that the worlds of science, policy, diplomacy connect, which we haven't seen, as much so before. So I really liked what Jan wrote in the policy brief that, we often see that we need to strengthen the science policy and society interface because we've seen these silent understandings, right, of something like a paradox, right? I think Yanni said, of politicization of science and the scientization of politics. So we want to bridge this gap, right? Knowledge and action. And we're really focusing here at the Johns Hopkins University Science Diplomacy Hub that I'll just describe briefly in a second, how to expand these opportunities for both the scientists to understand what is policymaking like, so get those skills, but also vice versa, for the policymakers and the diplomats to also understand the science behind the issues they work on. So briefly, some background about how this all started, how this case study of Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub came about. So Professor Peter Agre, who is very well known in the science diplomacy space, he's the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Distinguished Professor and Nobel laureate in Chemistry. He received this prize in 2003. So we put our heads together and launched the Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub last year, 2023, in the very heart of Washington, D.C. And this is really the first of this kind of the science diplomacy hub that's embedded within an academic institution like Johns Hopkins. And what's really important is that we have the proximity of the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center in DC, where the Science Diplomacy Hub hosts its activities, to institutions like, for example, Capitol Hill and others. And it's very strategic because it's what allows us to really use this ideal location to bring the research and expertise of the university to the global science diplomacy conversations and debates. So such institutions like Johns Hopkins, and academics here, we are really glad that we can establish such a science diplomacy hub that can be this hotspot where individuals coming from different sectors, whether it's science policy making, diplomacy, private sector, nonprofits, they can come together and start to think about in one space and time how to transition from talking to action, right? And have this opportunity to be part of the relevant convenings, dialogues, and also training. So I'll talk about the student part of our work as well. So again, really emphasizing the bridging of the knowledge and action gap being the central space to establish these partnerships. So our partnerships range from everything from embassies. So we have multiple countries working with us on different projects and different convenings. Germany, for example, is a very nice partner for us here. Then policymaking institutions, the private sector, we also have contributions to different events, knowledge contributions, for example, quantum events also that we do, nonprofits and beyond, to really solve issues ranging from topics like climate change innovation, sustainability, risks and benefits of technologies, of course, quantum and AI, they're there. So what really drives us as a science diplomacy hub is to provide first in-person access to the heart of science diplomacy in Washington, D.C. Then we really want to foster this community and interdisciplinary collaboration. So we're really big on ensuring that whoever, for example, I'm in the quantum field, so whoever is interested in learning more, whether they're from the biology side, and there's already a lot of interaction between biology and quantum, for example, that they can learn about each other, and that's when the beauty happens. So we foster this free exchange of ideas we have the ambitious goal of meeting the world's most pressing challenges. And some questions in science diplomacy we're trying to address, so they range from the intersection of these spaces, how one can complement the other, really establishing this two-way communication channel between these fields and how to address the challenges that exist. And then we use science, of course, as a vector to shape both national and foreign policies around the world. And again, I'll mention this in a second, how do we connect the rising science diplomats with those who can be in early, mid, or late stages of their science diplomacy careers? So what we have been doing since our launch at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Center in Washington is we convene the science diplomacy community that has been growing exponentially since the very beginning. So we have these convenings every month. And some examples of events that we do is, for example, the Global Quantum Strategies Overview event, again, done in collaboration with, whether it's, for example, the Embassy of Finland worked with us on the first iteration of this. So there we look at the opportunities, challenges, and points of collaboration, for example, in the quantum space. And these convenings that we have, they really focus on how do we contribute the contemporary perspective or definition of science diplomacy, as this field is really new, it's still evolving. So each of these events contributes a little piece to the puzzle that we're trying to understand. Okay, and also we are heavily focused on offering students, not only at Johns Hopkins University, but also beyond. So we're not exclusive to Johns Hopkins individuals, and we really want to offer them professional science diplomacy experience, connections that they cannot get in conventional academic environments. So our central goal then, one of the pillars, is to foster the growth of the growing global network of science diplomats that can be, as a prime example of how to initiate and importantly sustain long-term international collaborations. Some also things that we've done, and probably the biggest convening that we organized was this inaugural Science Diplomacy Summit 2024 that we held last month. Time flies. And we had 2 days filled with science diplomacy, hundreds of attendees from different countries, organizations that really work at the intersection of science diplomacy or are interested in it. Maybe they're not aware yet that they're working in science diplomacy, which we've seen happen a lot of times. I think, Martin, you mentioned also that people have been working in this space for many years, or perhaps they never called it science diplomacy. So some tracks that we covered include the climate change innovation, quantum, and AI, health, for example, international partnerships, and universities participated from around the world. So we have, for example, Canada, University of Ottawa was represented, University of Lucerne, Switzerland, and others. So these are the participants that we've had, and we're already thinking about the next year's iteration. How can we grow? How can we include more organizations? So if you're there, please let us know. And yeah, we're just really amazed by the amount of attention and enthusiasm we've received to do the science diplomacy work at Johns Hopkins University. So I think I'll finish here, and I'm happy to again connect or answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Ona. Thank you, Leah, Martin. So as we've outlined in the beginning of this conversation, there's a framework about strengthening in both the supply and the demand side in the science policy society interface. And I think you as the audience can agree that our speakers here were able to present some of the best practices, especially as they relate to academic institutions or the role of educators, but also in the case of the Science Diplomacy Hub, universities themselves as sort of the central hubs that can coordinate some of these conversations between scientists, policymakers, and the general public. And I think last but not least, the work of the United Nations as a central player in sort of offering technical advice, but also thinking about including and becoming more open to actually working with scientists as part of their own work and how those processes work. And Martin was able to share some really exciting projects that are undergoing and that we all invite you to explore more. But of course, part of this conversation is to also field some questions or comments from the audience. We have a few people here in the room with me, but also if there are people online who like to raise some questions, please enter them into the chat or let us know. We want to hear from you and engage in a conversation for the remainder of the hour. Marcus, please.
I'm Marcus Weller. So I had a question about how do we help evangelize the science diplomacy initiative, if you will, and how do we get more qualified people or stakeholders to identify as being science diplomats and to participate actively in the community to help it grow? So us as individuals in the audience, obviously you guys are already doing that, but how do we help?
So if I understood well, it's like, how do we promote this idea of science diplomacy? You mean to reach in wider public?
Yeah, and leverage word of mouth, among our, across our personal networks in order to help it grow.
I think that this is a very important question because at some point we are like, okay, we're talking like academics, like government diplomats, but finally, where we're trying to promote here today, it's about sustainable development, and like to a better society for the benefit of the citizens. And in the paper, Martin and Jan, they mentioned race awareness, Also, this activity that we're trying to do at the university is to raise awareness, starting these sustainable development goals, starting with the students and teachers, but like we need to come to the society. Exactly. So for me, I could give an example. So I'm sure that many of you, well, I know that Germany for environment and climate change, you guys are pioneering. But, in some countries it's different. So if today we talk about climate change and environment in my country, everybody knows about that. And everybody is aware of the implications that might happen if we don't try to prevent, the negative consequences. we are recycling garbage at home. We know that soon we will be able to use oil vehicles. We are in my own city. I'm here in New York. I use city bike as much as I can, but at the same time, you know, in my own city, we have transformed, you know, all it has to do with traffic, so that, you know, at some point the center is going to be preserved. Not so many vehicles are going to be able, like, so we are doing all this type of transformation in terms of climate change. So I feel that nowadays the general society is concerned about that and knows what's going on. With science diplomacy, I have to admit that I don't think that if we would now go to the street and with a microphone and then we say like, "Oi, what do you know about science diplomacy? Do you think it's relevant?" Maybe people don't know. I mean, normal people, not people like us who are, you know, in the field. So my idea about how to reach to the wider public has to do with this type of activities. On the one side, we are trying to promote a publication which can have maybe like an audience specific, but maybe not, maybe some other people who might be interested, you know, because it depends on the topic we have selected. But I think it can be very interesting for people, you know, in certain fields. But at the same time, education that we have talked today, the moment we start to introducing this type of notion and concepts and ideas in education, then the future generations are going to be aware. And of course, dissemination activities. And this has to do with fora, workshops, you know, conferences. I feel at the same time that the same that, you know, I'm thinking about our elected officials, you know. So they need to refer to those topics too, because that's another way that the society can learn that how this is vibrant, how this is important. So these are some ideas, but I'm happy to some other of my colleagues here, either in the room, either online, can also give some insight, because this is just something that came right to my mind, but I'm sure that's maybe some others want to share something here.
Thank you, Leah. I think I see both Martin's and Mona hands are up. So Martin, I think you were first, so please.
Thanks so much, Jan. Two thoughts on that. Number one is diplomacy always wants to be quiet, not too loud, right? So in diplomacy, we don't want to talk publicly about what we do, because then we are most efficient, right? So getting public attention is usually the kiss of death for any kind of diplomatic initiative. So that's kind of my first point on that. So I think like many of those initiatives work because nobody really knows about them. And the second point is that, and I maybe say that out of my own trauma, you know, a lot of us who are working in the diplomatic field say, well, I wasn't good at math, so I became a diplomat, right? Because science is very scary, and most of us are trained in social sciences where the hard sciences, you know, are taking a backseat. So I think apart from sensitizing colleagues, it's all about kind of getting the right skill set, right? And like being able to speak to very complex issues, and not just to speak to them, but also then decomplexify them. So things around science communication we haven't talked about here yet, but I think that's so important to you know what's the latest when it comes to scientific discoveries, and then being able to explain that in very simple terms to senior management that wouldn't care about precision, but how does that advance decision making, right? So those are the two things that come to my mind.
Yeah, and I'll jump off of that. Thank you, Martin. So exactly that. The field is also very, very new. Again, people who, for example, we meet all the time, they hear science diplomacy, but no one really knows what it means. And within the Johns Hopkins University, for example, you know, we have the hub, and we're educating, trying to communicate with everyone across all levels, whether it's the administration, for example, or students as well, faculty, explaining what even this means. Why is this important for scientists to have these skills? For example, communicating their expertise to policymakers. And then not being afraid. I think Marcus, you asked sort of how can you help? So being part of events that we, for example, organized in Washington, we've seen people who, again, didn't realize they are working in science diplomacy, and they come from, for example, private sector as well. We have quantum companies, let's say, from Finland, who maybe weren't aware that, you know, this is some like a field growing fast. But after they attend our convenings, they say, oh, actually, it does make sense why we would need to integrate scientists within our offices, for example, because we do also emphasize, if you want to have the best sort of menu of decisions out there based on evidence, you should have the scientists integrated within whether it's your office in Congress, Senate, or your, let's say, government affairs, group within your company. So attending and showing up is what matters, and that's when also students realize that, oh, I can talk to someone from Marcus, you're in the AI space. I can talk to someone like you, and we might be able to collaborate, and they as a scientist can contribute, for example, something that you're interested in, whether it's international collaborations or how to address any challenges you're having. So that kind of sort of answers your question. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ona. Julia, did we have a question from the online audience? Yes.
Yes, the question from Sumya, if I'm pronouncing that correct, is what are the opportunities for engineers, policymakers, etc., for professional growth in this field?
What are the opportunities for various careers?
Oh, I can jump in here. And my hand was raised anyway, so I'll over that now. So it feels like we are actually building these opportunities, specifically in science diplomacy. For example, here in Washington, we're thinking how to create a course, right, a program for science diplomacy in Washington, and expand it to other universities and other institutions, make it accessible to both diplomats and policymakers and whoever is interested from the science side. There are a lot of opportunities in science policy. For example, we have the DWIH fellowship that a lot of PhD graduates apply for at the end of their degree. So that's out there for engineers. For policymakers, that's an interesting question. How do they learn about what is science diplomacy or science policy? Maybe someone can chime in from that angle, from that space. But yeah, for the engineers, there are a few fellowships, but they're mostly focused on the science policy side of things. So for science diplomacy, that's where we're trying to plug in and create something as we go.
Thank you, Ona. Martin or Leah, do you have any comments about career options?
Yeah, well, I think that Martin mentioned before when he was talking about job profiles. So I feel that in the next, or even already, if students are looking for jobs, or not students, you know, like they're going to find that this type of knowledge, this type of scientific expertise is more and more demanded, you know. So I feel that it's something that it's going to be required in the future, and even current job profiles, you know, like this type of knowledge. And I also wanted to pick up on what Martin and Ona were saying before. This was related to the previous question on. Martin mentioned that, yeah, of course, diplomacy needs to be quiet. That's very important. And if we really want that certain of the initiatives and strategies are successful, we cannot tell. But the idea of when reaching a wider public, and as Ona was saying, that of course we cannot tell too much, but at least that the people, the citizens, as Ona was mentioning before, try to understand what's going on, what's happening, what's the meaning of diplomacy in the world, and how this can contribute, what diplomats and foreign ministers are doing, negotiations, you know, that many times not so many people are aware, you know. So that's what, when I talked before about reaching a wider audience, I mean in this sense, of course, keeping the secrecy that all the time is needed, you know, in this type of initiatives. Thank you.
I just want to do some advertising for our colleagues in the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. So there are courses that are open to the public for those who would like to educate themselves about, other case studies and techniques. And there's kind of a whole growing community of science diplomacy networks and training opportunities. So wanted to flag that. And the second one is really the will. I think we are still lacking non-social scientists that join public institutions in non-scientific positions, so political affairs, economic affairs, etc., which are, like myself, usually dominated by colleagues that have a background in international relations or law. So we really need kind of all scientists representative and contribute. So I think that's where a few changes have happened, but it needs the willingness also of those who have studied that and work in those fields to contribute. Back to you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And maybe I chime in here too and give perhaps, first of all, abstract answer to this question. I've earlier said that science diplomacy and this interface really faces a coordination problem. What does that mean in terms of career opportunities? Well, it means that those people who position themselves to be able to help facilitate this coordination problem, they are very well placed in joining the science diplomacy career track, if you will. And those are people who will have a skill set that is able to speak and build policy, but also is able to be scientifically minded and be able to draw on scientific knowledge in order to make better policy. So this is very much I think, a field in which we will be seeing a lot of growth in terms of people who can facilitate and coordinate this interchange and this interaction. We've heard earlier about processes at the local level or city level, people who work in bureaucracies across cities and regional offices and constituencies. There's a lot of opportunities to sort of fill these roles with a science diplomacy mind, if you will, and through that process really affect overcoming some of those coordination problems which we've outlined in the brief. I know we have another question here in the room by Paul. Paul, please introduce yourself briefly and your affiliation for the audience, and thank you for being here.
Paul Arthur Berkman, professor at the Harvard Law School, also at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. I was the one that introduced science diplomacy to UNITAR back in 2019, also with the International Science Council. I just wanted to respond to the question about a growing network of science diplomats. One of the things that we did in Cambridge, which is certainly Massachusetts, which is certainly available to every region that has universities, which is around the world, is we started something called the Doctoral Dissertation Enhancement Workshop. And the idea was that any field, whether it was natural sciences or social sciences or even indigenous knowledge, the research component that is being trained at the university level, in effect, is part of the journey to contribute as a science diplomat. And the observation is that data that is generated from research is fundamentally different than evidence for decisions. And the difference is that evidence for decisions involves institutions. And so, for example, a doctoral dissertation on mercury pollution, for example, in the absence of discussing the Minamata Convention or something dealing with disasters, not talking about the Sendai Agreement, is incomplete. And so simply introducing the context of the institutions that are making the decisions enhances the capacity of the research community and enables them to operate in areas as science diplomats. And that's certainly something that simply can be introduced in all institutions around the world by enriching the environment of the research by bringing in the institutions that ultimately make decisions that are relevant to those research activities. The other opportunity, and it was discussed in terms of career opportunities, and I think Una's comments are correct. Una's expressing a level of enthusiasm and passion and leadership in the sense of the program that is developing at Georgetown. There's a similar type of effort in Europe called the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance. And it's also populated by individuals that are early in their careers that are looking to create opportunities as science diplomats. And in a sense, the environment for science diplomacy is sufficiently young that the passion and the enthusiasm of next generation science diplomats is the answer to the question about those career opportunities. Certainly in terms of UNITAR, but it's not limited to UNITAR. There are other elements within the United Nations, such as UNESCO or the United Nations Environmental Program, that are also focusing on science diplomacy. And I would introduce in the context of this discussion, which is related to the Science, Technology, Innovation Forum, that science diplomacy is an unfunded mandate that crosses the entire United Nations, that every element of the United Nations would benefit from having the skills of science diplomacy in their shop.
Thank you so much, Paul. Are there additional comments or questions from our participants online? Are there other questions here in the room or comments?
When are the next science diplomacy meetings that we should be aware of on the calendar for this year?
Well, October 31st, the Future Forum on Science Diplomacy in an Era of Technological Disruption will be held at the Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub. 31st of October, open to the public. If you're interested, take a look at the German Center for Research and Innovation website for more information. Get in touch with us.
Have a Zoom option, although I didn't.
It will not have a Zoom option. It will only be live and in person. I leave it at that. But perhaps others here in the room or online who want to share any interesting upcoming events?
Yeah, I can start us off here. So we do a lot. I think for such a new science diplomacy hub. One event that we'll actually have on Monday that's called Science Meets Region. So we have Estonia and Rwanda. So maybe an unexpected combination of countries that will talk about their technologies of national interest. And we're bringing for the Science Meets Regions seminar series diplomats who talk about their perspective from their countries, and also bringing together researchers who are focusing on, for example, climate adaptability, air pollution problems and solutions to them into one space. So that's what we do. That's all in Washington. That's at the Bloomberg Center in DC and open to everyone. There's no fee. So we really emphasize this, that there is no fee to attend our events, which also was why we had so many participants at our Science Diplomacy Summit that we did in April. So that's in May, and then we'll have a June sustainability in agriculture, a colloquium together with the Embassy of Belgium. So that will bring together also researchers from Hopkins and Ghent University as well into one space to talk about everything, how to change the status quo, how does EU perspective differ from that we see in the US regulations and the science behind it. So that's in June, and in September we have September 8th, the Global Quantum Strategies Overview event for 2024, and that's done in collaboration with Quantum World Congress. That will happen the following few days. So that, and then October 31st, that Jan already highlighted the forum that we'll host. So all are welcome. Please come to DC.
Thank you, Anna. Paul?
I just wanted to, along the lines of what is opportunities, the Global Indigenous Youth Summit on Climate Change originated last year with UNITAR as the host. It on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which is the 9th of August. It was designed as a virtual dialogue by, for, and among Indigenous youth with global inclusion. Last year, it included 1,300 plus registrants from more than 112 nations across more than 88 languages. It will happen again on the 9th of August, 2024, this year hosted by Future Earth. So it's an opportunity for Indigenous youth leaders around the world to contribute in terms of discussion relating to climate, but also issues that are as important as decolonial thinking and so on.
Thank you, Paul. And I see, Leah, you have your hand up.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So I wanted to say thank you so much for the contributions of all the participants, in the table. And also, I'm very happy to hear all these upcoming initiatives from the institutions I'm affiliated. Now you know that the semester is about to end. But this semester we had plenty of interesting events that were in the intersection of science and technology related to global politics, which have been very, very interested. Right on Wednesday, we had Katin Donfried, and he was an excellent speaker, and she addressed many important global topics. And at the same time, so in September, when we come back to the teaching and, the events, we're going to have plenty of these opportunities in person, also online. I'm going to bring the science diplomacy line to the Institute, already I promoted this past semester and type of like a podcast interview related on artificial intelligence. And I'm going to try to bring more opportunities for discussion and research in this type of topic. At the same time, I wanted to suggest that the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies creates this podcast, which is called International Horizons. And this is also an opportunity, maybe now in the summer that we're not having any events, because the topics are very interesting, attractive, relevant in time, and also in the intersection of science, technology, policy, and society. Thank you again.
Thank you, Leah. And one last final plug from me. The German Center for Research and Innovation New York puts on a range of science diplomacy activities just like we did today. So please, if you're online, take a look at our website, join our newsletter. We're happy to invite you in person or virtually. And just as Ona said, our events are free of charge and open to the public in an effort to which I think we've just discussed, that is the Science Policy Society interface. With that, I really want to thank all audience members here in the room. It's been a long morning. It's been a pleasure to have you all here. To our speakers online, it's great to have you on board, to work with you, to continue this conversation, continue this effort, and to our participants online who joined us today. We will have this recording available later on next week, so we'll share a link if any of you want to share it with colleagues after the fact. But nonetheless, I wish you all a happy and restful weekend, hopefully without rain, and talk to you all soon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Happy weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Thank you.